Well, super PACs, let's first explain, are the independent groups that have unlimited funding capacity. You can raise as much money as you want, and that they tend to mount negative barrages on behalf of their allies. There's a Santorum has one, and of course they don't fully have them. They're slightly independent. It's kind of like, you know, common law wives. They're not really married, but they kind of act as if they are. And so I'm beginning to regret that comparison. But they're associated with, but not married to. How's that? Is that okay? We're getting better here. Campaigns, so they can fund negative barrages against candidates, and the candidate can say, well, you know, I don't know, I had nothing to do with this, and yet they're working on behalf of them. And this is a new thing that we have, and this was created by a Supreme Court decision in the last couple of years, the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court, and it's changed the whole calculus of politics. And so asking me what I think about that is kind of asking me what I think about the designated hitter rule. You know, I kind of wish the designated hitter rule would go away in the American League. I think it's ruined baseball, but it's here to stay. And for the foreseeable future, just like the DH rule, these super PACs are here to stay. And so the question now is, who can mount the most effective ones, or have the most effective ones mounted on his behalf? And right now, I think the reigning champion is Mitt Romney. Now, let me just start. This gentleman said that voters here are more plugged in but less informed, and that's because you don't buy your local newspaper. The local newspaper is a great paper. I talked to the editor today, and you should buy the paper because it's going to help. It's not only going to help him send his kids to college, but it's going to help enrich your lives also. But go ahead. We're going to take it sentence by sentence because you're very interesting here. So we say newspapers are dying and Jon Stewart is on the rise. Who's Jon Stewart? Okay, next, yeah. What role do I think journalism should play in politics? And of course it should play the predominant role. And what role should it play? Let me just, that's a fabulous question with a couple of really interesting predicates. Let me say that, for much of the modern era, and by modern era let's just say the 1948 election on, the first post-war election, the Truman-Dewey election, that from that period until around 2000, which was the unresolved 36-day overtime election, newspaper reporters played the role that the parties used to play. It's no coincidence that in that entire period, I guess after 48 at least, in that entire period there was not one open convention, contested nomination. Everybody won on the first ballot. And at the same time, I think the newspapers, I'm just developing this thought as I'm standing here, I hadn't thought about this before, that newspaper reporters played the role the parties used to play, which was to sort out winners from losers, to tell the public who was, the word we used to use was viable and who was not, who's a serious candidate and who was not. And we used to stand on the mountain, on Mount Olympus, and shout down to the public that Eisenhower was serious, Taft was going to be an irritant, Eisenhower would win, or Kennedy and Humphrey, and we basically, it was a one-way conversation, and a bunch of political reporters, a dozen at most, played this adjudicating role. I was one of those at the end of that period. The reporters of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and a few other, Boston Globe, and a few others played that role. And then with the democratization of the press and the what's the word I'm looking, decentralization of authority throughout society, but most important in anything involving communications, changed all that. And so the press now plays a far less important role in adjudicating among who's serious and who's not, and helping to choose the nominee and making those kind of preliminary choices, which no one elected us to do, and we were completely unqualified to do. So we do less of that now, and we do more of being part of a convener of conversation. I think that that's basically a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing that everybody's an expert without knowing anything. Now, that's a phrase that also will get me in trouble, but I think that political literacy is probably lower than it was 25 years ago among well-informed voters. Does remind me of the old story involving Adlai Stevenson, when somebody came up to him in 1952 and said, you know, Governor Stevenson, you're going to win the election because every thinking American is going to vote for you. And he said, yes, but I need a majority. But I think generally political literacy is down, and I think that's a bad thing. And I wish you'd all read the paper, because a lot of good stuff's being done in newspapers even today. What's the chance? You know, we always say, oh, this is the year that's going to be a brokered convention. And we always, on our side of the table, we always say that because it's going to be a lot of fun. And, you know, it's a jobs program for reporters, and we could use one of those. And none of us alive, none of us have ever covered that. We don't know how to cover that. It'd be fun. I think in the end, the party, I think the party now knows who its nominee is. This has, from the start, been a peculiar election because it's been more about mathematics than chemistry. There is no chemistry between any of these candidates and the public. But Mitt Romney, with an MBA from Harvard, has mastered the mathematics. He's really deficient on the chemistry, I think. But he's got the mathematics, and each week, I don't know if this is true, but this week he lost both contests, but said he increased his delegate margin. Now, I think there's some evidence to think that that might be true. But at some point, the other guys are going to fall so far behind that it's not going to be possible to catch up. So I think in the end, he may not go into Charlotte. It's Charlotte, right? Or is it Tampa? I can't remember which is which. He may not go into the convention with 1144, but by the time the balloting starts, he'll have it. I mean, Kennedy didn't have the requisite number in 1960, and he won by the time they got to Wyoming. It's not done alphabetically. I think that he'll have enough, but we sure would. I mean, we can't root for one or another, you know. But it would be kind of fun to do something that we've never done before. Third party, you know, there always is room for that, and there've been some, you know, flamboyant and fairly successful third parties in American history. 100 years ago, Eugene V. Debs. Well, 100 years ago, there were four parties, right? There was the Republicans, the Democrats, the Bull Moose Party, and the Debs Socialists. And if you want to argue that the Republicans split in two, you can say that the Debs was a third-party candidate. He was actually a fourth-party candidate, and he got 1 million votes. In 1924, Robert La Follette, you know, did fairly well. George Wallace in 1968. Less well, John Anderson in 1980. Ross Perot in 1982. That was 92. That was kind of a loony one. And I think it's easy to argue. I mean, I have argued and will continue to argue that the presidential campaign of Ralph Nader gave the election to Bush, or said another way, deprived Gore of an election. So we've had these in the last century. We've had, what, I counted 5. Oh, don't forget, South Carolina, the Dixiecrat movement by your own Senator J. Strom Thurmond, who split apart and who bolted the party in 1948 and basically ran for president himself. And so that's what, six times. It's possible, but not likely. I think the best chance would have been in 1996 had Colin Powell decided to run. Don't forget, he hadn't been Secretary of State yet. He was still shiny. And had he run for president in 1996 and said, I'm going to be a one-term president to end this bull here in Washington, I think he would have been elected. But he didn't do it, and don't listen to me, because I'm the person who thought Gary Hart would be a 2-term president. This is a very shrewd question. The gentleman has, I'm going to repeat it right now, has posited that the Republicans are running against government, and I think he's saying they want to be part of the government, and to win their role in government, they're running and saying they don't believe in government. This completely illogical formula is almost always a winner. Ronald Reagan won 2 gubernatorial terms and 2 presidential terms on this very theme. Even Democrats run this way. Bill Clinton ran that way both times. He was the President of the United States, and he ran against Washington. Now, Obama's going to pull this trick as well. And it's It's almost like a illusionist trick, but it works every time. And it's hard to be the head of the government and to run against the government, but these people are political gymnasts. They can do this. But it's a very shrewd question. I think the distinction I made earlier in the prepared part might be helpful, in which I said that the Republicans were anti-government without being pro-business. Now that hasn't happened. That's the new part of this. And what we saw, and I talked about it a little bit in the speech, was we saw Republicans using language that Democrats would like to use but would never dare. Class warfare language like, corporate viper and this kind of stuff. No Democrat would dare say that because they'd be, oh, you're a class warrior, you hate the rich, you hate America. And, but the Republicans use it against each other. And I thought that's the most interesting thing that's happened in 2012, is that the language of the Occupy movement was used by the enemies of the Occupy movement, the Republicans, and eluded by the folks who actually agree with the Occupy movement, the Democrats. They would never use that language. And yet the Republicans used it. And I think it's by far the most important and most interesting thing that's happened in the campaign this year. I think the chances for the Republicans to take the Senate were hurt by Olympia Snow's decision earlier this month not to run for, or maybe last month, not to run for election. She would have won, I think, fairly easily in Maine. I think it's less likely now than it might have been before. So, I mean, Americans kind of like divided government because we tend to do that a lot. And we've had, unity government. We had it in the Roosevelt years. We had it in the Kennedy-Johnson years, for example, and we had it among the Republicans in part of the Eisenhower years. But I think the Americans like to have, they've invented a check and balance that the founders didn't think of, and they like divided government. So I think that the chances are not that great. None of them. There's only been, let's see. All right, let's see. I'm not trying to be a wise guy here. Let's name the significant convention speeches in American history. The Cross of Gold speech in 1896 by William Jennings Bryan, right? The New Deal speech in 1932. The New Frontier speech in 1960. And Obama's speech in 2004 when he wasn't the nominee, when he said there's not a Republican Party or a Democratic Party, but an American Party. So there's what, 4 or 5? So my guess is none of them. I defy you to quote any other convention speech of your lifetime. Go ahead, Barb. Okay. So I don't think any of them will. Well, it's kind of late, but it's late and it's not. I mean, it's what is this, March 15th? About the time in the calendar when Bobby Kennedy joined the race in 1968, so it's not that late, I guess. But a lot of delegates have been chosen. Who would, if for some reason he couldn't continue, when I'm off microphone, we'll speculate on what kind of thing would result in that. Could be, who knows what kind of mischief we could come up with. But I think the party would like to nominate Jeb Bush as long as he didn't have that last name. He's Catholic. He's from a battleground state. He's smart. The party would like to nominate Chris Christie, who I think is also Catholic and from an important state, governor of Rhode Island, of New Jersey. I don't know who else. I think the guy that the Republicans, in their deepest, fondest dreams, would like to is Mitch Daniel, who is the governor of Indiana, but maybe too short to be president. He married the same woman twice, by the way. He doesn't. That's one of the reasons he doesn't want to run. He doesn't want to have that conversation. Second marriage, as you know, is the triumph of hope over experience. That was the I better stop. So when your grandfather was born, there were no Republicans in this state. Of the 22 senators in the 11 states of the old Confederacy in 1945, the 22 senators, 21 of them were Democrats. There was no Republican Party in this state when your grandfather was born, and there was hardly one when your father was born. And the Republicans basically run the state right now, right? So that's dramatic change in 2 or 3 generations. Now, what caused that? I think 2 things caused that. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, and when he did so, he said that I have just consigned the South to the Republicans for a generation. Now, for the next generation. You know that from 1865 to around 1965, which is 100 years, the Democrats controlled the South, the solid South. And now it's completely a Republican region. So it can change back, sure. Take my own state of Massachusetts. In my grandfather's time, it was a devoutly Republican state. The first Democratic senator wasn't elected until, I think, 1924. And Massachusetts is a very Democratic state right now. Take Vermont, that's a good example. Vermont was an unbelievably Republican state until around 25 years ago. And now it has a socialist in the Senate. He's a socialist. I mean, that's his party. And so in my childhood, in New Hampshire, which is my kind of second state, you would constantly see New Hampshire, which has voted for the Democrat the last 3 elections in a row. You constantly see signs, vote for Joe Smith, and it would say Democrat, no, it would say honest, trustworthy, conservative, as if those 3 things were moral equivalents. And New Hampshire's voted Democratic 3 times in a row, and if New Hampshire hadn't given as many votes as it did to Ralph Nader in 2000, Al Gore would be the former president right now. So who can say what's going to happen? I mean, things can change again, yes. Yeah, let's think about this. The women's vote didn't exist before 1920 except in a few states, right? You know, except in Montana and Wyoming and I think Idaho. And then the women's vote started in 1920. And for the first 2 generations, women voted the way their husbands voted. They did in my family, they did in your family too, I'm sure. If the husband was a Democrat, as they all were in South Carolina, then the woman was a Democrat. And then around 1967, 68, 1970, that began to change. And women started to have separate political identities. And by 1980, there was a discernible gender gap, which was the phrase that grew up in the Reagan election, where women tended to vote for Carter and men tended to vote for Reagan. Now, there's certain exceptions, of course, and now we have a situation where women vote a little bit more often than men vote. I don't know what it's like at this college, but at many colleges there are more women than men. Surely more women will get bachelor's degrees this year than will men. Women still don't earn as much as men, but are catching up, and in many cases surpassing them. And one of the great battles in this election will be for the women's vote. Now, the phrase women's vote is very, very misleading. In a nation of 300 million people, you have about 150 million women, and they're not all the same. And I'm not trying to be a wise guy. There's a huge difference among women who work on Wall Street and women who live on farms, and women who are electrical engineers, and women who are homemakers, and I don't need to go through it. I mean, but there still is a gender gap. It tends to lean Democratic, and President Obama hopes to exploit it. I mean, he's made it quite clear in the last week that that's going to be one of the major themes of his re-election. Now, whether issues like abortion and contraception are women's issues and will be to his advantage is something that we can't answer now. We don't really know. But he'll emphasize those kinds of issues in an attempt to get liberal-oriented working women who vote in great numbers to support him. So we've had a gender gap now for 32 years, and it's just as strong now as it was under the Reagan presidency, and I think it'll continue. It's an interesting factor. And again, that's the answer to your question. Well, there was no gender gap in the 1916 election because there were no women voters, right? But there still wasn't any gender gap either in 1932. But there's a significant gender gap now. These are factors that pop up in American politics, and they become part of the straw that stirs the drink. So, good question. I don't know. The question is, what will happen to the Medical Care Act if Romney becomes president and the Congress remains divided? I think in the end the Medical Care Act survives, but I'm only guessing. I think the Medical Care Act was a political calculation of incredible stupidity. And before anyone quotes me by saying it was stupid, which I didn't say, that there are a lot of juicy, good things in that for the public in that bill that the public will like. And they all go into effect in 2014, 2 years after the election. What kind of a White House loads all the goodies after the election? Doesn't make any sense. But I do think in the end it does survive. There's a huge constitutional question about its constitutionality. And I think in the end it'll survive, but again, this is anybody's guess. This is anybody's guess. This is a great question, and it's particularly the way it was put. Well, is there a change in the way we think about and with each other? And I think the problem here is that we don't think with each other anymore at all, that we don't talk to each other, that we argue past each other, and we tend to only listen to people we agree with. Now, I don't know what you all read, but I like to read the editorial page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and believe me, they never agree. And to read the New Republic and the Weekly Standard, which never agree. I think people now are attracted by views and news outlets that comfort them and affirm their prejudices and underline their inclinations. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing. And again, I know you think that the main sub-theme of this talk is why newspapers should survive, but I think that's one of the great qualities of the old era was that people encountered ideas they didn't necessarily expect to encounter. They read stories about things they didn't know they'd be interested in. There was a sense of serendipity in the reading experience. Today, I think there's less serendipity in the reading experience. If you're a liberal, you watch MSNBC and you read the New Republic and you read the editorial page of the New York Times, and you never encounter any conservative that makes you uneasy or makes you rethink your thoughts. And if you're a conservative, you watch Fox and you read the Wall Street Journal, and you never run into any liberal who might jar your assumptions. And I think that's a bad thing for the country, and I think it's contributed to polarization. I think in a way it defines polarization, or polarization is defined by it. And I think it makes for a less rich personal experience and a less contemplative and civic conversation. So I think you've hit on something that's very important, dangerous, and destructive. And I don't know what the answer is to it beyond hoping that people will snap out of it, because it's not good for the country or even fun for an individual. So it's fun to have a political conversation with someone you disagree with. And oftentimes your ideas are challenged in the most invigorating and exhilarating way. And I think we have less and less of that. And on our college campuses and in our coffee shops and around the dinner table and in our neighborhoods. And I think if there's anything to grieve over in the past couple years, it's not the things we usually complain about. It's that. And I think it's a bad thing for the country, and I think it's a bad thing for all of us. But I'm not giving a homily here. I'm supposed to be giving a political talk, so I better stop. Okay, the question is, in my opinion, who does the United States need? Okay, or as your English professor would say, whom does the United States need? And who would best serve that? Well, this is the time for a little lecture on the press and its independence. I'm of a creed and a generation and a craft that that disavows personal political opinions. I'm kind of like the court eunuch, okay, in a kingdom with beautiful women. Okay? I hang around these politicians, or used to, but I don't fall in love. This is becoming a dangerous metaphor. But our role, done correctly, is to view politics as an art form, to be art critics but not partisans. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. None of you believe me. You all think I'm a liberal from the Northeast. I don't vote in primaries. I usually don't decide who I'm going to vote for until the last week or last day. I like politicians of all sorts. I loved, I'm the big Eastern liberal newspaper guy whose favorite politician of all time is Bob Dole and George Bush. So I like the act done well rather than care about who wins. And I used to always say that when I covered Congress for the Wall Street Journal, that I never rooted for one side or another to win. I did root, though. I did root for whatever was going to happen before 5 o'clock so I could make the first edition. But beyond that, I don't care. And I don't care who wins this election. I mean, I don't care. That does sound so callous. I have a stake, I suppose, in who wins it, but I don't have an opinion about who's going to be best at it. And that's good for us because they come and go and we're still here, right? And I like politicians, generally speaking, although I don't really like the political ethos. I like politicians. And most really good reporters will tell you that they are not partisans, and that they have good relationships, good, solid, sound relationships of respect but not affection, friendly but not friends, with politicians on both sides of the aisle. And so in my own career, you know, I've been very close to, in some ways, I hope not dangerously, in the same year, to Jack Kemp and Michael Dukakis, and that very same year to Pat Robertson, and having known and been comfortable with both Bush and Gore. Now, they're not my friends. They don't come over to my house. I don't go to theirs. We don't go to church together or the Kiwanis, or not pals. But I have respect for people on both sides, and I like the performance done well more than, you know, I don't really care if it's Rimsky-Korsakov or if it's Beethoven, as long as it's really played really well. Okay, so I know that sounds a little haughty and arrogant, but really it is the ethos we have. Right, and there's one other thing, and I'm glad you're part of this small caucus that you and I are part of here. But it's character too. And I have voted for people for president with whom I have not agreed with anything they said, but because I thought they had a stronger character than the other guy. Now, maybe it's because I've had the privilege of knowing them better and seeing them in action, but I think character above all. And President Roosevelt used to say that the presidency is preeminently a job about character. It's a very hard job, and I think you should vote for the person who has the strongest character. And to me, it doesn't matter what they think about taxes. No. I like it when they use my column. I love it. I see it once in a while when I visit my mother, because she's of the age who get it. I'm not trying to be, my guess is that the week is skews older readers, maybe not you. But it seems to me to be pretty straight down the middle. I don't know, I don't read it very often, I see it. And I think it performs the role that the news magazines used to perform in the old-time Newsweek days, before they changed so much, of providing a pretty straight summary of the week's news. I used to say that Time magazine was for people who didn't read the New York Times that week. And I think, I used to laugh at it that way, but more and more I think that there's room for that. And it sounds like, though I don't really know, it sounds like the week, is that the role the week plays? Yeah. Yeah, and let's, just for the record, it's spelled W-E-E-K, not W-E-A-K. It's not for scrawny guys who get sand kicked at them at the beach. Yeah. Okay. So, the question is, what do I think about endorsements? So can I ask you how old you are? Okay. If your parents told you to do something, would you do it? It's the end of that's my answer.
I got to tell you, David, there's probably, a college president has to make a lot of tough decisions. There's probably not any one decision that makes me any more nervous at this place than deciding who the lecturer for this series is, because it is our most prominent and most high-profile series, and clearly you did not disappoint tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. Let me briefly thank Dr. Parkinson and the other faculty, staff, and students who helped facilitate the program tonight. And I'd like also to ask for a round of applause to help me thank the family of Mrs. Lois Walters-Coker, who are with us tonight, whose generosity has made this lecture possible. Thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.